In the brutal autumn of 1944, a lone black American soldier, cut off from his unit during the Allied push through France, refused to surrender. He made his final stand behind the stone wall of a village garden, vanishing in a storm of fire and fury, his story erased by the chaos of war and the indifference of the army he served. For 70 years, his sacrifice was a secret kept by the stones themselves, his name lost to history. The silence was finally broken in 2014, when a stonemason's chisel, repairing the wounds of that long-ago battle, struck something metallic. The discovery of his helmet, impossibly embedded in the heart of the wall, would not be the end of his story. Instead, it would be the beginning of a meticulous investigation to reclaim a forgotten act of heroism and restore the name of a soldier who, in his final moments, refused to be erased. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. The village of Sainte-Marie-du-Bois, nestled in the rolling, verdant hills of Normandy, was a place that measured time in centuries rather than years. Its heart was a collection of ancient stone houses and a Romanesque church, all clustered together as if for warmth against the winds of history. The village had survived plagues, revolutions, and the Great War. It had also survived the Second World War, but not without scars. The memories of the German occupation and the brutal battle for its liberation in 1944 were etched into the very stones of the village, in the pockmarks left by bullets and the dark, scorched patches on walls where grenades had exploded. In the summer of 2014, Élodie Fournier, an architect in her early 30s, had returned to this place of deep, quiet history. It was her ancestral home, and she was overseeing the restoration of the house that had been in her family for over 200 years, a project that was as much an act of love as it was a professional commission. The house, like the village, wore its history on its sleeve. Her great-grandmother, a formidable woman named Isabelle, had been a celebrated figure in the local French resistance, and the house's thick stone walls and hidden cellars had sheltered more than a dozen downed Allied airmen. The most significant damage was to the old garden wall, a thick, chest-high structure of local fieldstone and heavy plaster that had stood for generations. A large section of it had been blown apart during the fighting and had been left to crumble for 70 years, a silent, moss-covered monument to that terrible autumn. Élodie's plan was to restore it using traditional methods to heal this last visible wound of the war. The work was slow and painstaking. She had hired a local stonemason, a gnarled, taciturn man named Philippe, who understood the language of stone and lime mortar. On a warm, sun-drenched afternoon in July, Philippe was carefully chipping away at the damaged section of the wall, preparing to lay a new foundation, when his chisel struck something that was not stone. It made a dull, metallic thud, a sound that was alien to the natural rhythm of his work. He stopped, his curiosity piqued. He assumed it was a large piece of shrapnel, a common enough discovery in these parts. He began to carefully work around the object, his movements precise and delicate, chipping away the 70-year-old plaster and the compacted, rocky soil that had filled the breach. But the object was larger than any piece of shrapnel he had ever found. As he cleared away more of the debris, a distinct curved shape began to emerge. It was dark, rusted, and caked in a thick layer of mud and calcified plaster. Élodie, who had been reviewing blueprints nearby, heard the change in Philippe's work and came over to see what he had found. Together, they worked for the next hour, using smaller tools, a brush and a trowel, to excavate the object from its 70-year tomb. The shape became unmistakable. It was a helmet, an American Monet helmet, its iconic, pot-like form a symbol of the liberation that had swept through this village 7 decades earlier. But the discovery was more than just a relic. It was an impossibility. The helmet was not simply lying in the rubble. It was embedded in the wall. It was lodged deep within the core of the structure, held fast by the stones and the ancient mortar, as if it had been placed there by the original builders. It was a part of the wall's very fabric. Philippe, A man not given to flights of fancy stared at it, his weathered face a mask of pure astonishment. "It is not possible," he muttered, shaking his head. The wall was built 100 years before the Americans came. Elodie ran her fingers over the cold, rough surface of the rusted steel. She could feel the history radiating from it, a silent, powerful energy. This was not just an object. It was a story of a single, violent moment in time, a moment so powerful that it had fused a soldier's helmet into the heart of her family's home. She looked at the wall, at the pockmarks from bullets that surrounded the embedded helmet like a grim constellation. She looked at the helmet itself, at the jagged, angry-looking hole that had been punched through its front. This was not a place where a soldier had simply lost his helmet. This was a place where a soldier had died. This was a tombstone, a marker for a last stand that history had forgotten. A deep, profound sense of responsibility settled over her. She was not just the owner of this house. She was now the custodian of this mystery. She knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she could not simply remove the helmet and repair the wall. She had to know the name of the man who had worn it. The story of the helmet in the wall was a local curiosity, a strange little historical footnote that made a small, 2-paragraph article in the regional newspaper, La Presse de la Manche. The article was accompanied by a single, grainy photograph of the rusted helmet, its iconic shape instantly recognizable, its impossible placement in the stone wall, a source of local wonder and speculation. For most who read it, it was a fleeting curiosity, a quaint reminder of a war that was rapidly passing from living memory into the realm of myth. But for one person, the small article was a lightning bolt. Dr. Amara Vance, an American military historian, saw the picture in the headline, and her academic and personal worlds collided with the force of a tectonic plate. Amara was in France on a prestigious research grant, but her work was far from the grand, sweeping narratives of D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge. At 42, she had carved out a niche for herself in the lonely, often frustrating field of historical reclamation. Her specific focus was the unrecorded history of the nearly 1 million African-American soldiers who had served in the European theater. Her life's work was a patient, painstaking effort to find the stories that had been deliberately or carelessly erased from the official record. She was a historical detective, sifting through obscure logistical records, pension applications, and the fading, handwritten letters of soldiers, searching for the voices that had been silenced by the systemic racism of a segregated army. She knew that for every celebrated white hero whose story was told in books and films, there were 1,000 black soldiers whose courage and sacrifice had been rendered invisible. She was working in the National Archives in Paris when a colleague, knowing her area of expertise, showed her the article. Amara stared at the photograph of the helmet. The article mentioned that the village of Sainte-Marie-du-Bois had been liberated by a specific American infantry division, a division that, according to the official records, had no black soldiers in its combat units. But Amara knew better. She knew that black combat engineer, quartermaster, and transport units were often attached to these divisions, operating in frontline support roles. Their presence rarely, if ever, mentioned in the official after-action reports. She also knew that in the chaotic, fluid fighting that had characterized the Allied push through France, neat distinctions between frontline and support roles often dissolved in a storm of shrapnel and machine gun fire. The helmet in the wall spoke to her not as a curiosity, but as a piece of evidence. The placement, the violence implied by the damage to the helmet and the surrounding wall, it all pointed to a last stand. A single soldier, cornered and defiant, fighting to the last. This was exactly the kind of story that was never recorded. A lone soldier, particularly a black soldier separated from his unit, dying in a forgotten skirmish, would not be the subject of a commendation. He would, at best, be listed as missing in action, his true fate a mystery, his heroism a secret that would die with him. The helmet was a chance to recover one of those secrets. It was a tangible link to a story that had been swallowed by the silence of history. Within 24 hours, Amara had packed a small bag, postponed her work in the archives, and was on a train to Normandy. She felt a sense of urgency that was both professional and deeply personal. Her own grandfather had been a combat engineer in a segregated unit that had served in France. He had spoken of the constant indignities, but also of the quiet, unacknowledged courage of the men he had served with, men who had fought and died for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. For Amara, this was not just an academic exercise. It was a mission to reclaim a piece of her own heritage, to honor the memory of her grandfather and the countless men like him whose stories had been deemed unworthy of being told. She arrived in the sun-drenched, peaceful village of Sainte-Marie-du-Bois, a place that seemed a world away from the violent history she had come to investigate. She found Elodie Fournier's house easily, the partially restored garden wall a clear landmark. Elodie, who had been contacted by Amara in advance, greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and relief. She was an architect, a woman of logic and precision, and the mystery of the helmet had taken root in her mind, a puzzle she felt compelled to solve. The two women, one French, one American, one the keeper of the place, the other the keeper of the history, stood before the wall. Amara, her movements precise and reverent, began her examination. She saw not just a helmet, but a crime scene. She saw the trajectory of the bullets, the blast pattern of the explosion, the final desperate moments of a man's life. Amara said, her voice a quiet, somber statement of fact. Someone fought like hell right here. My job is to find out who he was. The world of Corporal Isaac Dubois in the autumn of 1944 was a world of mud, steel, and a quiet, simmering rage. At 24, he was a man who seemed to be built of a different, more thoughtful material than the chaos that surrounded him. He was tall and lean, with long, skillful hands that, back home in the bayous of Louisiana, had been used to crafting fine wooden furniture, not to laying charges of TNT. He was a carpenter by trade, a combat engineer by the arbitrary decree of the United States Army. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his eyes observant and his mouth often set in a firm, unsmiling line. He was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, his voice was a low, steady baritone, his words chosen with the same precision he used to measure a cut of wood. His unit, the 1317th Engineer General Service Regiment, was a segregated unit. A small, self-contained island of Black America set adrift in the vast, the white ocean of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Their official job was to follow in the wake of the advancing infantry, to perform the brutal, back-breaking labor that was essential to the war effort, but devoid of any of its supposed glory. They rebuilt the bridges the Germans had blown, cleared the roads of mines and debris, and laid the foundations for the camps and supply depots that were the lifeblood of the push toward Germany. It was hard, dangerous, and thankless work. They were treated not as soldiers, but as a pool of cheap, expendable labor, their white commanding officers viewing them with a mixture of paternalistic condescension and deep-seated suspicion. Isaac endured the daily indignities with a stoic, almost unnerving calm. He ignored the casual slurs, the inferior equipment, the constant reminders that, in the eyes of the army he served, his life was of a lesser value than that of the white soldiers whose path he was clearing. His anger was not a hot, explosive thing. It was a cold, hard, and deeply principled core of self-worth that he refused to let them touch. He had a small, worn book of Langston Hughes's poetry that he kept tucked in his field jacket, and in the quiet moments, he would read the words, finding in them a voice for the complex, bitter irony of his own existence. He was fighting a war for the four freedoms, a war against a racist, totalitarian regime. Yet he was forced to live under a system of racial segregation that was its own form of tyranny. His defiance was quiet, but absolute. It was in the meticulous perfection of his work, the way he could set a support beam with a level of precision that was a work of art. It was in the way he carried himself, with a straight-backed dignity that refused to be bowed. And it was in his unwavering loyalty to the men he served with, the other black soldiers who were his brothers, his family, the only people in this foreign, hostile world who truly saw him as a man. They shared a bond that was forged in the crucible of this shared, dual struggle, the fight against the Germans in front of them, and the fight against the prejudice that surrounded them. In late 1944, the 1,317th was attached to an infantry division pushing through the dense, difficult terrain of Normandy. The fighting was brutal, a slow, grinding advance from one ruined village to the next. The neat lines between front line and rear echelon had ceased to exist. Isaac and his fellow engineers often found themselves working under direct fire, clearing mines while machine gun bullets snapped through the air above their heads, their rifles as essential to their survival as their shovels and their saws. It was in this chaotic, violent landscape that Isaac had honed a new set of skills. He had learned the deadly geometry of a firefight, the rhythm of an enemy mortar barrage, the precise, terrible moment to take cover. He had become a soldier, not by choice, but by necessity. He still hated the noise, the waste, the sheer, brutal stupidity of it all. But he had discovered within himself a deep, cold well of courage, a quiet determination to survive, not just for himself, but for the men at his side, and for the simple, profound idea that his life, his black life, mattered. He would not allow it to be thrown away cheaply, either by a German bullet or by the careless indifference of a white officer. His survival was its own act of rebellion. Dr. Amara Vance began her investigation with the two things she could trust: the artifact and the place. The helmet and the wall were the only pure, unadulterated pieces of evidence she had. She arranged for a team of forensic specialists from the University of Caen to conduct a thorough analysis of the site. While she waited for their report, she began her own deep dive into the official military records, a process she knew would be like trying to find a single needle in a continent-sized haystack of lies, omissions, and bureaucratic incompetence. Her first task was to confirm the identity of the American units that had fought for control of Sainte-Marie-du-Bois in the autumn of 1944. The records were clear. The village had been a key strategic crossroads, and the battle for its control had been a brutal, week-long affair. The primary American force involved was the 29th Infantry Division. As she had suspected, the 29th was an all-white division. The official after-action reports, the daily logs, and the casualty lists contain no mention of any attached black units or soldiers. According to the official history of the United States Army, there were no black soldiers in Sainte-Marie-du-Bois. The helmet in the wall was, according to the records, an impossibility. But Amara was an expert in navigating the hidden architecture of the Army's segregated past. She knew that the official records only told one story, the story the white command structure wanted to be told. The real story, the story of the black support units that were the logistical backbone of the entire Allied war effort, was hidden in a different set of files altogether. She shifted her search from the combat records of the 29th Division to the logistical and movement orders of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It was a mind-numbing, soul-crushing task. She spent days scrolling through endless reels of microfilm, her eyes aching from the strain, searching for a single, telltale name or number. Finally, after a week of fruitless searching, she found it. A single, obscure transport order, dated October of 1944, authorizing the temporary attachment of a platoon from the 1,317th Engineer General Service Regiment to the 29th Infantry Division. Their mission: to provide road and bridge repair support for the division's advance. The 1,317th was a segregated unit. It was the smoking gun. It was the official, undeniable proof that black soldiers had been there. But the records were maddeningly vague. They listed the unit, but not the individual soldiers. There were no casualty reports, no after-action summaries for the platoon's activities. They had been a ghost unit, their presence a logistical footnote, their individual fates unrecorded, and, to the Army, unimportant. While Amara was hitting a wall in the archives, the forensic report from the team in Sainte-Marie-du-Bois landed on her desk, and it was electrifying. The metallurgical analysis of the helmet confirmed it was a standard-issue Monet helmet from a production run in early 1943. The hole in its front had been made by a high-velocity projectile, consistent with a round from a German Mauser rifle, fired at close range. But it was the analysis of the wall itself that was the most revealing. The team had found and extracted dozens of bullets from the stones and the plaster. The ballistics confirmed a two-way battle. There were German 7.92 mm Mauser rounds fired at the wall, and there were American .30 caliber rounds from an Monet Garand fired from the position behind the wall. The report painted a clear, violent picture. A single American soldier, armed with a standard-issue rifle, had taken cover behind this wall and had engaged in a ferocious firefight with multiple German soldiers. He had not been a passive victim, caught by a stray bullet. He had been an active combatant, fighting for his life. The most stunning discovery, however, came from the geological analysis of how the helmet had become embedded in the wall. The lead forensic geologist was unequivocal in his conclusion. The helmet was not placed there, and it was not driven in by a force from behind, he wrote. The fracture patterns in the surrounding stones and the way the helmet itself is deformed indicate that it was propelled into the wall by a massive, concussive blast that originated directly in front of it. The force required would be equivalent to that of several grenades or a small satchel charge detonating less than 2 feet away. Amara read the words, and a new, terrible, and heroic theory began to form in her mind. The soldier had not been killed by the bullet that had pierced his helmet. He had died in an explosion he had likely set off himself. This was not just a firefight. This was not just a last stand. This was an act of self-sacrifice. The soldier behind the wall had been cornered, and he had chosen to take his enemies with him. The mystery of his story deepened, the scale of his courage growing with every new piece of evidence. She now had the how. She had the what. But she still didn't have the who. She had the story of a hero, but she did not have his name. The chaos began just after dawn. Corporal Isaac Dubois and his platoon had been working through the night, their powerful floodlights cutting an artificial ghostly glare through the pre-dawn mist. Their task was to clear a path through a section of road on the outskirts of Sainte-Marie-du-Bois that the retreating Germans had heavily mined. It was tense, nerve-wracking work, a delicate, deadly dance with buried steel and high explosives. They were exposed, isolated, and keenly aware that the quiet, picturesque village just up the road was still held by the enemy. The American infantry was supposed to have secured their flank, but the fog of war is thick and unforgiving, and the lines on a map are often a fiction. The first shell landed without warning, a screaming, demonic whistle followed by a deafening crump that sent a geyser of mud and shrapnel flying into the air. It was a German mortar, and it was perfectly ranged. The first explosion was followed by a second, and then a third. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of noise, smoke, and terror. The American infantry, who had been dug in on the ridge above, were caught completely by surprise. A German counterattack, a sudden, violent lunge from the village, had broken through their lines. SS troops, masters of infiltration and brutal, close-quarters combat, were swarming their position. Isaac and his fellow engineers were not infantrymen, but they were soldiers. They grabbed their rifles and took cover, returning fire as best they could. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. Their commanding officer, a white lieutenant who had spent the past week treating them with a sneering contempt, was one of the first to fall, cut down by a burst of machine gun fire. His death and the collapse of the infantry's position shattered the platoon's cohesion. It was no longer a battle. It was a rout. The order came down. A panicked shout passed from man to man. "Fall back, every man for himself." In the chaos of the retreat, their transport truck took a direct hit from a Panzerfaust, the German equivalent of a bazooka. The explosion was catastrophic, flipping the 2.5-ton vehicle on its side and turning it into a raging inferno. Isaac, who had been providing covering fire from behind the truck, was thrown violently to the ground by the concussion. A white-hot piece of shrapnel tore through the flesh of his left thigh, a searing, blinding pain that almost made him black out. He lay in the mud, his ears ringing, his vision blurred, watching as the last of his comrades vanished into the mist, their panicked shouts fading into the distance. He was alone. He was wounded, and he was trapped deep behind the newly re-established enemy lines. He forced himself to move, his training overriding the pain and the fear. To stay in the open was to die. He began to crawl, dragging his wounded leg behind him, towards the dubious shelter of the village. He moved from one shell crater to the next, the sounds of the battle now all around him. He could hear the harsh, guttural shouts of the German soldiers, the crack of their Mauser rifles, the terrifying rhythmic chatter of their MG-42 machine guns. The village of Sainte-Marie-du-Bois was no longer a place of quiet, picturesque beauty. It was a hunting ground, and he was the prey. He found his way to a small stone house on the edge of the village, its slate roof partially collapsed, a large, jagged hole in its side. He crawled through the hole, collapsing onto the dusty floor of what had once been a family's kitchen. He was, for the moment, safe. He took a moment to tend to his wound. The shrapnel had torn a deep, ragged gash in his thigh. It was bleeding badly, but it had missed the artery. He pulled out his first aid kit and did his best to clean and bandage the wound, his hands clumsy with pain and adrenaline. As he worked, he took stock of his situation. It was bleak. He had his Monet Garand rifle, 3 full clips of ammunition, and 2 fragmentation grenades. He was one man, wounded, with a handful of bullets, against what sounded like an entire platoon of elite German troops. The logical choice, the sane choice, was to find a place to hide, to wait for the battle to move on, and then to try to make his way back to the American lines under the cover of darkness. Survival was the primary objective, but as he crouched in the ruins of the French family's home, peering through a crack in the wall, he saw something that changed the calculus of his survival. He saw a group of SS soldiers dragging 3 people from the cellar of the house across the street. They were not soldiers. They were French civilians, 2 men and a woman, their hands bound, their faces a mixture of terror and defiance. They were members of the resistance, and the SS officer in charge, a man with a cold, cruel face and the death's head insignia on his collar, was preparing to execute them on the spot. Isaac watched as the officer drew his pistol. In that moment, the war ceased to be an abstract struggle between armies. It became a simple, terrible choice. He could remain hidden and save himself, or he could intervene, and in doing so, almost certainly condemn himself to death. The logical choice was to stay silent. But Isaac Dubois was not always a logical man. He was a man of principle. The search for a living witness, for someone who had seen the face of the soldier who had died behind the wall, seemed like a hopeless quest. 70 years is a lifetime. Memories fade, people move away, and the silent, inexorable tide of time washes away the details of the past. But in a small, tightly knit village like Sainte-Marie-du-Bois, memory is a stubborn, communal thing, passed down from one generation to the next. After several days of gentle, respectful inquiries, Amara and Elodie were directed to the home of Monsieur Jean-Luc Renaud. He was, they were told, the village's patriarch, its memory keeper, a man who had been born in the village, had lived his entire life there, and had seen it all. They found him sitting in a sun-drenched chair in his small, meticulously tended garden. A man in his early 80s, his body frail, but his eyes bright, clear, and filled with a sharp, undiminished intelligence. He greeted them with a formal, old-world courtesy, and listened patiently as Amara, with Elodie translating, explained the purpose of their visit. When she mentioned the helmet in the wall of the old Fournier house, a profound and complex series of emotions washed over the old man's face, a flicker of a deep, ancient sadness, a hint of a long-suppressed fear, and a spark of something that looked almost like gratitude. "Ah," he said, his voice a soft, raspy whisper. "The wall. So, After all this time, someone has finally come to ask about him. He invited them inside, to his small, dark living room, a space that felt like a museum of a single, long life. He sat them down, and with a quiet, solemn dignity, he began to tell his story. He was not a historian reciting facts. He was a witness, a man unburdening himself of a memory that he had carried, alone, for 70 years. In the autumn of 1944, he had been a boy of 10, a small, curious child who had been told to stay in the cellar of his family's home as the battle for the village raged outside. But the curiosity of a 10-year-old boy is a powerful force, and the terrifying, thrilling sounds of the war were an irresistible lure. He had crept up the cellar stairs and had peeked through a small crack in the heavy wooden door that led to the outside. His home was directly across the narrow street from the Fournier house, and the crack in the door gave him a perfect, secret vantage point of their garden wall. "I was watching the Germans," he said, his voice barely audible, his eyes looking not at Amara or Elodie, but at a point in the distant past. The SS. They were like angry dogs, running everywhere. And then, I saw him. He paused, gathering his thoughts. He was an American soldier, but he was not like the other Americans we had seen. He was a giant, it seemed to me. And he was black. I had never seen a black man before, only in pictures. He was moving from the ruins of the Fournier's house, and he was hurt. He was dragging one of his legs. He took cover behind the wall, the very place where you found the helmet. The boy, Jean-Luc, had watched, his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of fear and fascination. The American soldier was alone, and the entire German force seemed to be converging on his position. He was trapped. He was checking his rifle. Jean-Luc continued, his old wrinkled hands mimicking the long-ago movements. He was so calm. Not like a man who was about to die. He was like a man who was going to work. And then, the soldier had looked up. His gaze had swept across the street. And for a single, heart-stopping moment, his eyes had met the eyes of the small, terrified boy who was watching him from the crack in the door. Jean-Luc's voice faltered, his eyes filling with tears. "I thought he would be angry," he whispered. "I thought he would shout at me to hide, but he was not angry. He looked at me, and he knew I was scared. And he nodded, just a small, quick nod. And he gave me a little smile. It was not a big smile. It was a sad smile, but it was a smile. It was a smile that said, 'It's all right, boy. You will be safe.'" And then he turned back to face the Germans, and the world exploded. The old man's testimony was the missing piece, the human heart of the story that Amara had been searching for. The soldier behind the wall was no longer an abstract hero, a collection of forensic data. He was a man who, in his final, terrifying moments, had taken the time to comfort a frightened child. His final act had not been one of hatred and violence, but one of profound, unbelievable compassion. The helmet in the wall was not just a relic of a battle. It was a monument to a quiet, forgotten moment of grace. The choice was not a choice at all. For Corporal Isaac Dubois, crouched in the ruins of the French kitchen, it was a simple, terrible, and unavoidable imperative. He watched through the crack in the wall as the SS officer, his face a mask of cold, arrogant cruelty, raised his pistol to the head of the first French resistance fighter. In that moment, the carefully constructed logic of his own survival, the plan to hide, to wait, to escape, dissolved into the dust. He could not watch this happen. He could not remain silent while innocent people were murdered in cold blood. To do so would be a betrayal of every principle he held, a surrender of the very humanity he was fighting to defend. His life was already forfeit in the eyes of his own army. He would not make it forfeit in his own. He took a deep, steadying breath. He knew what he was about to do. It was a suicide mission. He was one man, wounded, with 3 clips of ammunition, against an entire platoon of elite enemy soldiers. The odds were not just long, they were non-existent. But the objective was not to win. The objective was simply to act, to make a stand, to prove, in this final desperate moment, that he was here, that he mattered, and that he would not be a passive witness to atrocity. He pushed the barrel of his Monet Garand through the crack in the wall. He took aim, not at the officer, but at the soldier standing next to him, the one holding the second prisoner. He exhaled, and he squeezed the trigger. The crack of the Garand was a sharp, authoritative sound in the sudden, tense silence of the street. It was the sound of a moral universe reasserting itself. The German soldier crumpled to the ground, a look of pure, shocked surprise on his face. For a split second, the entire scene froze, a tableau of disbelief. The SS officer stared at his fallen comrade, his mind struggling to process this impossible, audacious attack from an enemy he had believed to be vanquished. That single, frozen moment was all the diversion the French prisoners needed. They exploded into action, their survival instincts taking over. The two who were still standing shoved the remaining guards and sprinted in opposite directions, zigzagging through the narrow, rubble-strewn street. The third, the one who had been on his knees, rolled and scrambled for the cover of a nearby bombed-out building. The SS soldiers, their attention now ripped away from their helpless captives, began to fire wildly, their bullets chewing up the stone walls of the houses. Isaac did not wait to see what happened next. He knew his position was now compromised. He immediately pulled back from the wall and began to move, his wounded legs screaming in protest. He had to find a better defensive position, a place where he could make them pay for every inch of ground. He scrambled out of the back of the ruined house and into the overgrown garden behind it. And there, he saw it. The thick stone garden wall of the Fournier house. It was perfect. It was chest-high, made of solid, ancient stone, and it offered a clear field of fire down the narrow alley that ran alongside the house. It was a natural fortress, a place where a single, determined man could hold off a much larger force, at least for a little while. He took up his position behind the wall, the rough, cold stone, a comforting, solid presence against his back. He laid out his 2 remaining clips of ammunition and his 2 grenades. He checked his rifle. He was calm. The fear that had been his constant companion since the ambush had receded, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. He was no longer a carpenter from Louisiana or a combat engineer in a segregated army. He was a soldier, defending his position. He was a man, defending his honor. He could hear the Germans regrouping, their harsh, angry shouts echoing through the village. They knew where he was. They were coming for him. He was not just an obstacle to them now. He was an affront. He had challenged their authority, had humiliated them in front of the very people they were trying to terrorize. They would come for him with a special kind of fury. Isaac looked down the narrow alley. He looked at the solid, unyielding stone of the wall. He thought of the small, worn book of poetry in his pocket. He thought of the quiet dignity of his father. He thought of the promise he had made to himself, that he would not die a victim. He chambered around. He was ready. The forensic report on the wall was a dry, scientific document, but it told a story of almost unimaginable violence. Dr. Amara Vance read it in her small temporary office in the Sainte-Marie-du-Bois town hall. The technical language of the geologists and ballistics experts, painting a vivid, terrifying picture in her mind. The wall, they had concluded, had been the epicenter of a short but incredibly intense firefight. They had identified the impact marks of at least 3 different German weapons: a Mauser K98 rifle, an MP-40 submachine gun, and an MG-42 machine gun. The sheer volume of fire directed at the small section of the wall where the helmet was found was staggering. The soldier had been facing not just a handful of riflemen, but a full, heavily armed assault team. The American evidence was just as compelling. They had recovered 24.30 caliber casings from the ground behind the wall, all fired from the same Monet Garand rifle. 3 full clips. The soldier had fired every single bullet he had. The placement of the casings suggested he had been moving, shifting his position behind the wall, creating the illusion of a larger force. He had not just been firing wildly, he had been fighting with a cool, tactical discipline. He had made his 3 clips of ammunition count, but it was the final, stunning conclusion of the report that confirmed Amara's growing theory and elevated the story from one of a desperate last stand to one of a deliberate, final act of defiance. The analysis of the blast residue and the fracture patterns in the stone was definitive. The massive concussive explosion that had embedded the helmet in the wall had been caused by the detonation of multiple German Model 24 potato masher stick grenades, bundled together to create a single, powerful explosive charge. The key finding was that the grenades had been German, not American. Amara cross-referenced this with the historical records. The SS Panzergrenadier units that had been operating in this sector were known to carry bundled grenades as a standard tool for clearing out fortified positions. The story now clicked into place with a terrible, heroic clarity. The soldier had not just been defending himself. He had likely captured the grenades from one of the first Germans he had killed. He had held onto them, his final hidden trump card. Amara stood before the wall once more, this time with Elodie and a visibly emotional Jean-Luc. The scientific data provided the script, and her historical knowledge allowed her to direct the final, tragic scene. "He was out of ammunition," she explained, her voice low and filled with a profound respect. "He had fired his last bullet. The Germans knew it. They would have heard his rifle go silent. They would have started their final assault, moving up this alley, confident that he was now helpless." She pointed to the ground in front of the wall. They would have been right here, preparing to storm his position. They would have seen him as a trapped animal. His fight over. But his fight wasn't over, she continued, her gaze fixed on the helmet, a silent, rusted testament to that final moment. He had one last weapon, their own. He would have waited until they were close, until they were all clustered together in this narrow space. And then, she paused, the weight of the words heavy in the quiet air. He would have detonated the charge. He would have known it would kill him, but he also knew it would take them with him. It was not an act of desperation. It was a tactical decision. It was his final, defiant move. The helmet, she explained, had been driven into the wall by the force of that explosion, a freak, one in a million event. The blast had propelled it with such velocity that it had punched through the plaster and had become a permanent part of the wall's structure, sealing his story in stone. The explosion would also have triggered the collapse of the already damaged section of the wall, burying his body and the bodies of the Germans he had killed under tons of rubble, hiding the evidence of his final, incredible act from the world. He had not just made a last stand. He had turned his own death into a weapon. He had refused to be captured. He had refused to be a victim, and in his final, violent act, he had transformed his grave into a monument. The battle for Sainte-Marie-du-Bois was a brutal, chaotic affair, and SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Richter was a man who thrived on chaos. He was a veteran of the blood-soaked Eastern Front, a man who had seen and perpetrated horrors that would have shattered a lesser man. But Richter was not a lesser man. He was a product of the SS ideology, a true believer in the purifying power of violence and the absolute necessity of order. He was not a screaming, hysterical fanatic. He was far more dangerous than that. He was a cold, pragmatic, and ruthlessly efficient professional. He saw the world as a series of tactical problems to be solved, and the solution, in almost every case, was the application of overwhelming, disciplined force. His mission in Sainte-Marie-du-Bois was simple: to retake the village, to execute any captured resistance fighters as a lesson to the rest of the populace, and to delay the American advance for as long as possible. The initial counterattack had been a textbook success. The American infantry had folded, the support units had been scattered, and the village was back under his control. The execution of the captured partisans should have been a simple, routine piece of battlefield administration, a neat and tidy conclusion to a successful operation. And then, a single rifle shot had shattered his perfect, orderly world. The sudden, audacious attack from the ruined house had been more than just a tactical annoyance. It had been an insult. It was an act of illogical, irrational defiance that offended his deeply ingrained sense of order. A single, unseen enemy had, with a single bullet, unraveled his carefully laid plans, allowing his high-value prisoners to scatter. For Richter, this was an intolerable breach of discipline, not just on the part of his enemies, but on the part of the universe itself. His initial fury quickly cooled into a cold, predatory focus. This was no longer an operation, it was a hunt. He could have bypassed this single, isolated pocket of resistance. He could have left a small team to deal with it and moved on with his primary mission. But that was not his way. The presence of this lone, defiant soldier was a loose thread in the tapestry of his control. And he was a man who could not tolerate loose threads. He would not move on until this anomaly was corrected, until this defiant voice was silenced, until order was restored. He deployed his platoon with the cold, precise geometry of a master chess player. He sent a team to flank the position, another to lay down a base of suppressive fire with the MG-42 machine gun, and he himself would lead the final assault. He was not just going to kill this soldier. He was going to dissect him, to take him apart piece by piece, to make an example of him. The soldier's refusal to surrender was, in Richter's mind, a form of madness. And it had to be met with the cold, hard logic of overwhelming force. But the soldier was not mad. He was good. The first assault team that tried to move up the alley was met with a volley of accurate, disciplined fire that sent them scrambling for cover, leaving one of their own dead in the street. The lone American was using the wall and the ruins to his advantage, firing and then moving, never giving them a clear target. Richter's frustration began to mount. This was taking too long. It was becoming undignified. His elite, battle-hardened SS troops were being held at bay by a single, unseen enemy. He ordered the MG-42 to open up, to saturate the wall with a torrent of continuous fire, to literally chew the stone apart. Under the deafening cover of the machine gun's roar, he led the second assault team forward himself. He was a hunter, and he was closing in for the kill. They reached the end of the wall, the air thick with the smell of cordite and pulverized stone. The American's rifle had fallen silent. He was either dead or out of ammunition. The hunt was over. "He is finished," Richter said to his men, a cold, triumphant smile on his face. "Move in. I want him alive, if possible. I want to look into the eyes of the man who thought he could defy us." He and his men rounded the corner of the wall, their weapons raised, their expressions a mixture of predatory excitement and relief. They saw him. He was slumped against the wall, his rifle on the ground beside him. He was not dead. He was looking at them, and in his hands, he was holding a bundled charge of their own stick grenades, the pull cords already drawn. The last thing SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Richter saw was the soldier's calm, defiant eyes and a small, sad smile. The climax of the battle for Sainte-Marie-du-Bois was not a prolonged, epic struggle. It was a short, brutal, and intensely personal war, fought in the space of a single hour, in the confines of a single, ruined garden. Corporal Isaac Dubois, behind the solid, comforting presence of the stone wall, had become a force of nature. A quiet, thoughtful man, transformed by circumstance into a warrior of almost mythical proportions. He was no longer fighting for a country or a cause. He was fighting for the 10-year-old boy who was watching him from across the street. He was fighting for the French partisans he had saved. He was fighting for the simple, profound, and in that moment, the only important idea in the world, that he would not die on his knees. He used his 3 clips of ammunition with the economy and precision of a master craftsman. He did not fire wildly. Each shot was a deliberate, calculated act. He waited for the SS soldiers to expose themselves, to break cover, and then he would fire, a single, sharp crack from his Garand, followed by the satisfying, metallic ping of the ejected clip. He used the terrain with an innate, architectural understanding of angles and fields of fire. He moved constantly, shifting from one end of the wall to the other, firing a single shot and then disappearing, creating the illusion that he was not one man, but several. His first 2 clips accounted for 3 of the SS soldiers, and his disciplined, accurate fire had completely stalled their initial, arrogant assault. They were forced to fall back, to regroup, to treat him not as a single, isolated nuisance, but as a fortified, determined enemy. The fury of their response was a testament to his effectiveness. The roar of the MG-42 machine gun when it opened up was a physical thing, a wave of pure, concussive sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the village. The air above his head was filled with a terrifying, constant stream of lead, the bullets chewing at the top of the wall, sending chips of stone and plaster stinging into his face. He pressed himself flat against the ground, the vibrations of the impacts running through his body, and he waited. He knew this was the end game. The suppressive fire was a prelude to the final assault. He had 1 clip left, 8 rounds. He also had the 2 German grenades he had taken from the first soldier he had killed, and the small satchel charge of TNT he carried as part of his engineer's kit. 8 bullets, and 1 final, terrible explosion. He loaded his last clip into the Garand. The familiar, solid thump of the mechanism was a comforting, final sound. He waited for a lull in the machine gun fire, the moment he knew they would begin their advance. It came. The MG-42 fell silent, and in the sudden, ringing silence, he could hear them. The scrape of boots on rubble, the clink of equipment. They were coming. He rose up from behind the wall, just for a second, and fired. He did not aim. He simply fired as fast as he could pull the trigger. His 8 rounds a final defiant roar of defiance, designed to make them keep their heads down for just a few more precious seconds. He heard a cry of pain. He may have hit one. It didn't matter. He dropped the empty rifle. His work with it was done. With a speed and efficiency born of his engineer's training, he worked in the final, desperate seconds of his life. He took the 2 German grenades and the satchel charge, and using a strip of cloth from his own torn uniform, he bundled them together, a single, powerful, improvised explosive device. He pulled the friction igniters on the grenades. He had 5 seconds. He looked up, and he saw them, the SS officer, Richter, and his men, rounding the corner of the wall, their faces a mixture of triumph and predatory rage. He saw their eyes widen in a moment of pure, dawning horror as they saw what he was holding. Isaac looked at them, and he felt not hatred, but a kind of weary, profound pity. And then, he let the charge fall to the ground in front of him, and the world dissolved into a single, cleansing, all-consuming flash of white light. The name was the final, missing piece of the puzzle. For weeks, Dr. Amara Vance had been living with the ghost of the soldier behind the wall. She knew how he had fought. She knew how he had died. She knew the quiet, profound compassion he had shown in his final moments. But he was still an abstraction, a symbol. Without his name, his story was incomplete, his sacrifice anonymous. The official records had been a dead end. The combat files were silent. The casualty lists were a blank. She had the story of a hero, but she could not give him the one thing he had earned more than any medal: his identity. Her breakthrough came not from the combat records, but from the dull, unglamorous world of military logistics. She had a theory. The soldier was an engineer. He had been part of a support unit. The army might not have cared enough to record his death, but they were meticulous, obsessive, about tracking their equipment. Every truck, every crate of ammunition, every roll of concertina wire was accounted for. Somewhere, in some dusty, forgotten ledger, there had to be a record of the men who were assigned to that equipment. She shifted her search to the archives of the Army Quartermaster Corps. It was an even more daunting task than searching the combat records. She was looking for a single platoon, from a single regiment, on a single day, 70 years ago. She spent weeks in a state of near monastic devotion, her world shrinking to the flickering screen of the microfilm reader. She cross-referenced transport manifests with fuel requisitions, payroll records with daily movement orders. She was building a detailed, microscopic picture of the 1,317th Engineer Regiment's movements in the autumn of 1944. And then, she found him. His name was not on a casualty list. It was on a vehicle assignment roster. A single, typed line on a faded, yellowed piece of carbon paper. A deuce-and-a-half truck, serial number USA 23,589, had been assigned to a platoon of the 1,317th. The roster listed the men assigned to that truck, and there, fourth on the list, was his name, Dubois, Isaac, CPL. The record noted that the truck had been reported destroyed by enemy action on October 12, 1944, near Sainte-Marie-du-Bois. The men assigned to it were all listed with the same cold, bureaucratic designation, Mia. Missing in action. Amara stared at the name. Isaac Dubois. It felt solid, real, human. She said it aloud, a quiet whisper in the silent archive. Isaac Dubois. She had found him. She quickly cross-referenced the name with the Army's personnel files. She found his enlistment record. Corporal Isaac Dubois, from a small rural parish just outside of Lafayette, Louisiana. His civilian occupation, carpenter. He had a mother, a father, and 2 younger sisters. He had no wife, no children. He was 24 years old when he had vanished from the world. The official report on his disappearance was a single dismissive paragraph. It stated that Corporal Dubois and the other men on his truck were presumed to have been killed when their vehicle was destroyed. There had been no search, no investigation. In the brutal calculus of the war, they were simply gone, their individual fates a minor, insignificant detail. His story, his incredible, heroic last stand, had been completely and totally erased, reduced to a single 3-letter acronym on a logistical form. Amara felt a wave of profound, righteous anger, followed by an equally profound sense of triumph. The indifference of the Army, the racism that had deemed his story not worth telling, had not won. The truth had survived. It had survived in the memory of a 10-year-old French boy. It had survived in the forensic evidence of a battle. And it had survived, impossibly, in the form of a rusted helmet embedded in a stone wall. A silent, patient witness waiting for someone to come and listen to its story. She had all the pieces now. She had the place, she had the witness, she had the forensic evidence, and now she had the name, Corporal Isaac Dubois. She could finally give him back his story. She could finally tell the world what he had done. The ghost of the soldier behind the wall was no longer anonymous. He had an identity. He had a home. He had a family. And now, thanks to her, he would finally have his honor. The final act of the story did not take place in an archive or a laboratory. It took place where it had all begun, at the garden wall in Sainte-Marie-du-Bois. The wall had been fully and beautifully restored, but the section where the helmet had been found was different. The helmet itself had been removed and taken to a museum, but in its place, the stones had been left exposed. A small, sacred square of raw, unplastered history. Amara Vance stood before the wall with Elodie Fournier and an elderly, frail, but visibly proud Jean-Luc Renault. The circle was now complete. The architect who had found the artifact, the witness who had seen the man, and the historian who had recovered his name, were all gathered to bear final witness. Amara, her voice clear and steady in the quiet Normandy air, began to tell the story, not as a historian reciting facts, but as a storyteller honoring a hero. She wove together all the threads of her investigation, the science and the memory, into a single, powerful narrative. She spoke of Corporal Isaac Dubois, the quiet carpenter from Louisiana, a man of principle who had been thrust into the heart of a brutal war. She described the chaotic battle, the moment of his separation from his unit, the wound that had crippled him but had not broken his spirit. She told Jean-Luc of the reason for the soldiers' sudden, audacious attack. He saw them, Jean-Luc, she said, her eyes meeting the old man's. He saw the SS preparing to execute the resistance fighters. He could have stayed hidden. He could have saved himself. But he chose to act. He opened fire to save them. He drew the entire German force onto himself. The nod he gave you, it was the nod of a man who knew what he was about to do. He was telling you not to be afraid, because he was taking all the danger for himself. Then, she turned to the forensic evidence, explaining the final, terrible, and heroic moments of his life. She described how he had fought until his last bullet was gone. And then, she described his final, defiant act. He was out of ammunition, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. He was cornered. The SS were closing in for the kill, but he had one last weapon, a charge of their own explosives that he had captured. He waited for them to get close, and then he detonated it. It was an act of ultimate sacrifice. He chose to die on his feet, not on his knees. And he chose to take his enemies with him. She explained how the force of that final, self-inflicted blast had been so powerful that it had propelled his helmet into the wall, embedding it deep into the stone, a freak accident of physics that had turned his grave into his own permanent memorial. The explosion had buried him and the SS soldiers he had killed under tons of rubble, hiding his story from the world for 70 years, until a stonemason's chisel had finally brought it back into the light. Jean-Luc listened, the tears streaming freely down his wrinkled cheeks. The fragmented, powerful memory he had carried since he was a boy was now complete. The soldier was not just a brave, anonymous figure. He was a man with a name and a story of courage that was more profound than he could ever have imagined. Elodie, too, was deeply moved. The wall of her ancestral home was no longer just a structure of stone and mortar. It was a monument, a sacred place, a testament to an incredible act of heroism that had taken place on her family's doorstep. The ghost that had haunted her property now had a face, a name, and a story of honor. The mystery was solved. The story of Corporal Isaac Dubois was no longer a secret. The legacy of Corporal Isaac Dubois was cemented not in a quiet academic journal, but in the heart of the village he had died to protect. The story, meticulously documented by Dr. Amara Vance and championed by the mayor of Sainte-Marie-du-Bois, became a local and then a national sensation in France. It was a story that resonated deeply with the French people, a tale of an unlikely hero, a Black American soldier who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their liberation. The restored garden wall of the Fournier house became an unofficial shrine, a place of pilgrimage where villagers and tourists alike would come to pay their respects. The official recognition from the United States Army was slower to come, but it was inevitable. Presented with Amara's exhaustive and irrefutable research, the forensic reports, the eyewitness testimony, the logistical records, the Army's Historical Review Board had no choice but to act. The original dismissive report listing Isaac Dubois as missing in action was officially amended. His story, in all its heroic detail, was entered into the permanent record. And, in a rare and significant move, the board posthumously awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor, for his extraordinary heroism and his selfless act of sacrifice. A formal ceremony was held in Sainte-Marie-du-Bois the following summer. A delegation from the U.S. Army, including a high-ranking Black general, came to the village. Amara Vance had managed to track down Isaac's closest living relatives, the grandchildren of his younger sister, a family from Louisiana who had never known the true story of their heroic great-uncle. They were flown to France to attend the ceremony, to stand on the ground where their ancestor had made his final, incredible stand. The ceremony took place in the garden of the Fournier house, in front of the restored wall. The wall itself was now a formal memorial. A simple, elegant bronze plaque had been affixed to the stones. It read, in both French and English, "Here, on October 12, 1944, Corporal Isaac Dubois, 317th Engineer Regiment, United States Army, a man of quiet courage and profound principle, gave his life in a final, defiant act of heroism. He refused to surrender. May his sacrifice never be forgotten. The Army general presented the Distinguished Service Cross to Isaac's grandniece, a young woman with the same quiet, intelligent eyes as the soldier in the old black and white photograph. The French mayor spoke of the enduring bond between the village and the American liberators, and specifically of the debt of gratitude they owed to this one forgotten soldier. An emotional Jean-Luc Renault, speaking for all the villagers, told the story of the nod, of the small act of compassion that had been the soldier's final human connection. Dr. Amara Vance stood at the back of the crowd, watching the ceremony unfold. Her work was done. The story had been reclaimed. The name had been restored. The silence had been broken. She looked at the wall, at the simple bronze plaque, and at the family who now knew the truth of their heritage. The ghost of Corporal Isaac Dubois was no longer a mystery. He was a hero, his story finally told, his honor finally satisfied. His legacy was no longer a rusted helmet trapped in a wall, but a permanent, living part of the history of two nations, a testament to the fact that no act of courage, no matter how long it is buried, is ever truly lost.